Okay, this is just a short introduction to lesson study with specific reference to how it might be useful within the work of higher education, and builds on some of the work of people like Serbin, who have already done a small amount of work in HE and lesson study already within the USA. One way in which we can think about teacher development, be it within schools or universities, is to think about teacher development, how we develop our expertise in teaching and learning. And the general view, certainly within schools, within some systems around the world, is increasingly down what Hargreaves and Fullan call a business capital route. In other words, teacher as technician. Somebody else provides all of the curriculum materials and the thinking, and the teacher is just seen as somebody who delivers the material. But they argue that actually the best way of looking at the development of high quality teachers is to think about this notion of professional capital. And they argue that there are three types of capital which make up the overarching principle. The first is human capital, and is based around the development and knowledge and skills in teaching. Obviously at HE level we would hope that subject knowledge is already very advanced within those who are teaching, is part of our research agendas, and obviously we need to have a very good level of subject knowledge, although we can always learn new things. But more importantly is developing up both our knowledge and our skills about the process of teaching. And they go on really to argue that one of the best ways of developing our knowledge and skills around teaching is around the whole idea of social capital, working in groups, working in communities to consider pedagogic questions and difficulties and to work on them together to try and find solutions. And that can only really occur where we have decisional capital, where it's the teachers who have the actual discretion and they have the authentic ability to make decisions about what it is they are going to teach and how they're going to teach it. Now, whilst this may be a problem in the school sector in places, it certainly isn't on the whole in universities, where actually we have a great deal of freedom. So at an HE level, it would seem to me that we have a huge amount of decisional capital already. We can have a large amount of human capital with regard to both subject knowledge and pedagogy, if we're willing to give time over to discuss and to develop our understanding of teaching and learning. But the one area of professional capital where historically we may have been weak is in the notion of interaction and social relationships. Schulman's notion of sort of pedagogic isolation, pedagogic solitude, is still very prevalent in a lot of teaching within universities. People teach, nobody else is really involved, they close the door and get on, and they act in this sort of environment of solitude within their teaching. And as a consequence, teaching isn't necessarily a major part of the development of sort of scholarly communities, although obviously the scholarship of teaching and learning has played a very important role in trying to overcome this, and I think this is where there is an important crossover between the stated aims of scholarship of teaching and learning and what can be provided by lesson study. But if all of this is to be done properly, obviously it requires both space and time, so it's something that people have to be willing to buy into. Just as a bit of background, lesson study comes from Japan originally, where it's been used in the education sector for well over 100 years. And again, thinking about the crossovers between this and scholarship of teaching and learning, whilst some of those involved in lesson study may argue that it isn't action research, I would certainly argue that it is a type of action research, given that it's sort of centred around this idea of planning, teaching, observing and evaluating, leading back to planning again. So in many ways you could claim that lesson study is a particular type of action research, and as such again fits well within and very, very nicely within the whole framework of scholarship for teaching and learning. And the whole focus of lesson study is trying to gain a deeper understanding of students' learning, so that as we begin to engage with lesson study, the idea is that we can use it as a vehicle for refining and considering the pedagogies we use to help students learn. And as such, it is very much a deep, continual process which people can be involved in, rather than just sort of certainly with what in the school sector is thought of as being a sort of top-down, sort of just dip into different lessons just to see what's happening kind of thing. So this is about deep reflection, deep consideration of learning issues and problems and how we can overcome them, and through doing that how we can improve our pedagogies. In terms of sort of teacher development, there's very little literature within the HE setting. Where it does exist, there's only about 9 papers ever been published on lesson study in higher education. But across those papers there is a generally positive set of results about the utility of lesson study. There's a much greater literature, well over 150-200 papers in peer-reviewed journals, which consider the development of teachers more generally, mostly within the school sector. And therefore there's a growing body of evidence about the utility and the possible issues with lesson study. And what the studies on the whole seem to suggest is that it is a very powerful approach to teacher education and professional learning, that actually it is a very useful method or medium for helping people to understand learning and to begin to develop their pedagogic insights and practices. In England there's very limited research. There's certainly no research at HE level, apart from the research that we're presently doing in the School of Education at Leicester, which we hope to publish very soon. But there is the beginnings of a literature within England at the school level. And one of the main things that sort of comes out of this sort of idea of teacher development is that it's collaborative and reflexive. And therefore it sort of reiterates and emphasises this idea that actually working together as a group, as a community, and trying to develop teaching and learning in that way can have a very positive impact. And as I said before, therefore shows very clear links to some of the stated aims of scholarship of teaching and learning. Just very quickly, an introduction to how lesson study works. The idea, essentially, starting at number 1 at the top there, is that a number of teachers, lecturers, whoever, form a group. The work that we've done at HE level has tended to be in groups of either 2 or 3, and the people involved identify a specific challenge that students appear to have within their learning. So we tend to do a lot of our work on understanding our pedagogies with international master's students. And one of the areas that we wanted to look at was the fact that they always seem to struggle with their first written assignment, or certainly some of them struggle with their first written assignment during a master's degree, because the style of referencing is different, The way that they are meant to be involved in critical reading is different. The way that they critique academic papers is different to what they're used to within their own undergraduate learning. And therefore, one example of a lesson study cycle that we've been involved in is to actually look at designing something that would introduce and would help students understand the requirements and also the processes of writing a good academic master's level paper early on within their master's course. So we decided that was our focus, and having done that, we went on to number 2, and here we actually then designed a research lesson. And within lesson study, the idea is that you essentially create a lesson plan, and we spent probably for a 2-hour seminar session, it probably took us about 3 hours to actually design the session itself. And the way that we did that was to think about each phase of the session, probably cutting it into sort of 5 or 10 minute chunks unless particular activities were longer, and really going into quite a lot of detail about what we were doing, how we were going to do it, why we were doing it that way, so that we had a very clear understanding of each element of teaching as we went through the session. But then in conjunction with that, really beginning to reflect upon and think about and model the learning behaviours that we expected from the students themselves. So it isn't just a case of writing a detailed plan about what you're going to teach, but also including within that plan as detailed a version as possible about the learning behaviours that you're expecting to see from the students themselves. Once the lesson has been designed, the next phase, number 3, is that one of the team actually teach the session whilst any remaining members observe. And the important thing here is that they observe students, they don't observe the tutor. At this point in the cycle, we're not actually interested particularly in what the tutor's doing, because they're only delivering what we've all agreed. What we're actually interested in is observing, noting down, understanding the actual actions and the learning processes of the students themselves. And following on from work by Pete Dudley, who brought lesson study to the UK, each observer only observes 3 students, so that they can really focus in on the detail of the processes that students are going through as they complete the work within the session. Choice of those students is very much determined by the focus of the learning challenge, but generally you try to think about different types of students. So within an international grouping, you might decide to look at students from different nationalities, or you may want to look at students who have different levels of English proficiency, or you have to decide which variables might be most useful to help you gain a cross-section of students from the wider student body within the seminar, and then you focus on those few individuals, and you basically look at the expected learning behaviours, and you write detailed observation notes about what they're doing at each point in the session. You might want to note down things they've said or things they've done, and also comparisons really between what you're expecting and what they do. Do they actually do what you thought they would? Subsequent to the session, the pair or 3 or the team of people involved then meet up and they evaluate the session, and the idea really is to focus in on the evidence that has been observed during the session, to see really whether or not there is any particular evidence that learning has happened, that the learning has happened in the way that was expected, but also where the learning was different and what this might mean. And then, having done the evaluation, that then leads to sort of resolutions for future practice, and it might be that sort of certain things have been learnt and then they're taken forward to the next part of the work of the same group, or they're taken to a different group, or what have you. The insights are what are important. Now, one of the issues with this is that observation is only ever very partial. It's only a very narrow record of learning, and often not particularly objective. And it certainly doesn't allow us to begin to understand the full complexity of learning. So you can begin to use other methods around just the observation, videoing of lessons, perhaps audio recording of student dialogues on sort of tables, collecting samples of student work. And certainly one of the things that we found invaluable is that as soon after the session as possible, the students that we have observed, we will ask to do individual interviews with, and we get them to bring their work with us and then use stimulated recall interviews, using what they've written in the sessions as the stimulus to try to get them to give us as detailed a reflection as possible of the learning processes they were going through, so that we have some hope of, if you like, sort of making explicit the cognitive processes that they were going through. One of the ways that we've started to sort of think about this is that by making the discussion about teaching and learning explicit, by actually doing it as a group, it allows us to get into the whole notion of what we call pedagogic black box, whereas a lot of our practice is internalized, rarely discussed, is just part of who we are. The idea of working in a pair or a group is that it allows us to begin to make explicit those pedagogic beliefs, how we believe teaching and learning fits together, and therefore, rather than just seeing pedagogy as this single thing that nobody really begins to force open, what it allows us to do is to really begin to deconstruct and make explicit all the various elements of pedagogy and how we believe they fit together. And by linking the planning and the execution and the evaluation together, it allows us to really begin to understand and discuss and evaluate pedagogic processes and approaches at far deeper level. What it can also do over a period of time is, if the people who are doing this work together, then you can begin to form a type of team pedagogy, so that people begin to understand or have a shared understanding of what learning means and what good learning and teaching looks like, which is then the basis for further discussion and further exemplification, etc. However, we have to accept that a lot of what goes on, certainly in terms of student learning within classes, as I was saying before, remains hidden. And therefore, one of the big considerations is how we understand learning, and as a consequence of how we understand learning, how we begin to employ a far more complex array of methods to help us capture the dynamics of what's actually happening, so that we can get a truer and deeper picture of how learning and teaching actually take place. One of the things that we've started to find from all the research that we've done, these are just sort of some of the features that we've sort of covered or have become explicit in the data that we've gained, which has actually mostly been from initial teacher education. It hasn't really been thus far in HE, although we are beginning to analyse data and intend to publish soon on that. But also from those features, what our emerging findings are. So in terms of the quality of teacher learning, so if teachers or tutors take part in lesson study, what actually is the quality of the learning they gain from using this approach? And we would argue that that is still, in a quantitative sense, that's still very unclear. We can't sort of make it very simplistically explicit, But having said that, at a perceptual level, all of those people that we've worked on with lesson study who've gone through a complete cycle and have utilised the technique have all endorsed it as being a very positive, very potent approach to helping them learn about pedagogy. One of the things we have noticed in terms of roles and influences is that where hierarchies do exist, in other words, if you have far more experienced tutors and less experienced tutors, within the transcripts of meetings, those hierarchies are still quite clear. The more experienced, the more insightful, possibly, do actually play a more central role to the discussions. But what the transcripts also show is that everybody else is involved, that people very rarely just sort of do what the most senior person sort of suggests they ought to do, and that senior person actually in many cases becomes an important resource for other people to help develop their own expertise. And it's important to state in saying that the more experienced people do learn as well. They just learn something different. So everybody's gaining from the use of lesson study, but they're gaining in different ways. In terms of pedagogic content knowledge, we found that there is the opportunity to really explore the link between subject knowledge and the kind of subject knowledge that we're trying to develop, and its link to pedagogy and the kind of pedagogies that are best suited to actually developing understanding of particular subject knowledge domains. We do see what we think are improvements to pupils' learning, but again it's mostly perceptual. It's very hard to get data to prove that, but there does appear to be a lot of evidence developing that actually students do actually learn from this process. Teachers have also generally discussed how they find the approach improves the quality of their classroom practice and is relevant to their classroom practice. And in terms of it being a vehicle for future development, everybody that we've worked with have said how important it is as a vehicle, how desirable it is as a vehicle for future development, but that the one thing that can often get in the way is actually finding the time to do it properly. We have 2 or 3 challenges, however, in consideration of how we get the most out of these studies. The first of all, the first one is how we actually characterise learning, in the sense that learning is an incredibly complex process. It occurs differently in different contexts. The stated aims of learning are different in different contexts. So, for example, Schulman talks about this idea of signature pedagogies, that actually, perhaps in different disciplines, pedagogy looks different. And if the pedagogy looks different, is the aim of learning different? Is the process of learning different? Difficult to tell. Second one, as I've already said, is how we capture the process of learning through various methods. And whilst we feel as if we're getting a better handle on that, we still think that we're a long way from having really clear, really deep understandings of learning through the data that we've collected. And then obviously the final part is actually analysis of the data that we do collect. How do you bring things together, and how do you actually begin to create coherent, deep narratives off the data that you actually collect? And again, that's something that we're still working on. So ways forward. First of all, we would argue that a sort of a way of seeing the use of lesson study and what it gives us in terms of learning is very similar to the notion of sort of standing on a boat facing the shoreline on a very foggy day. The work that we've done thus far has allowed us to catch glimpses of the landscape on land between the fog, and therefore we feel as if we can begin to really begin to extrapolate between the bits that we can see to give us an overall view of the landscape. But we are continuing to do research and deepening our understanding of methodology in this area, together with its ramifications for wider work of lecturers and teachers. And therefore we hope over a period of time more of the fog will begin to blow away so that we can see more of the landscape. But actually we are quite resigned and happy to be resigned to the idea that we'll never get a completely clear view, that actually learning is so complex and occurs in such a complex way and much of it obscured because it's a cognitive process, that actually will always have a level of extrapolation to make. And therefore, as part of that, we believe that another way forward is to continue to deepen our discussion of learning as a process. I think there's a lot now of attempts just to see learning as, say, a cognitive process. It's just about, memory and what's left in the memory long term. But what about the social aspects? What about the emotional aspects? Learning is a very complex process, particularly at HE level, where a lot of that learning isn't actually done with the tutor, but is actually done away in informal learning spaces using online materials, etc. The complexity of learning becomes far more difficult to analyse and to track. Our basic way of understanding learning at this point in time, to give an idea of how we've approached it, is to use the work of Knudel-Ellis, who argues that there are sort of three dimensions of learning, each of which is complex and multifaceted in its own right. But he argues that the individual person has two dimensions to their learning: the cognitive, which is obviously the elements around attention and perception and memory and all the sort of cognitive elements of learning, but that they work in concert with emotional elements of learning. He talks about the idea of giving mental energy over to something, that if somebody isn't willing to give their mental energy to their learning, then actually they'll learn very little, perhaps even nothing. And actually the only way that you get people to give their mental energy over to learning is through sort of issues around things like motivation and engagement, etc. And therefore emotion and cognition together give you the idea of acquisition of learning. But the individual almost always is in some way embedded within the social, and that's where you get the whole notion of interaction. So those three dimensions tend always to work together. You could claim, for example, that actually reading a book is a social form of learning, because actually what you're doing is, by reading that book, you're engaging with the voice, the ideas of another person. So even there, it isn't just a cognitive process. And then finally, what we're beginning to look at, and we've done this mostly from a school level, but I think this is an interesting, potentially an interesting concept to also think of in terms of its association with scholarship of teaching and learning, is the concept that we're developing of pedagogic literacy. And we would argue that pedagogic literacy is something that all humans have. It's just the level of literacy that is different. So children will teach children, parents will teach children, children will teach parents. It's something that goes on all of the time in human existence. We all have a natural inbuilt capacity to help other people learn and to teach. However, what is different between a parent and a child teaching one another and somebody teaching within a formal educational setting is the level of expertise, the level of reflection, the level of understanding and knowledge that comes from their engagement with pedagogy as an explicit process. And that's why I would argue that to a certain extent pedagogic literacy sits alongside the idea of scholarship of teaching and learning. And this is just picking up a few of the elements of pedagogic literacy that we've started to begin to argue are dimensions of this. This isn't exhaustive, but it includes things like the philosophies, attitudes and values of the tutor or the teacher. So I'm going through Kreber's work again at the moment on authenticity within teaching and learning. Are we being authentic in the way that we develop pedagogies with people? So philosophies, our values in how we develop pedagogy are extremely important as part of our literacy of it. Our collegiality. Do we work with others? Do we discuss? Do we develop ideas and share ideas with others, so that not only are we involved as practitioners, but we're trying to extend our own understanding through engagement and discussion with others, and also taking ideas from other people to help us understand ideas that are new to us, and again thereby extending our overall literacy. There's also the idea of personal reflective practice, and reflection as a central element in understanding what we're doing and where we want to go. The professional skills that we develop, curriculum development, instructional design and development, instructional processes, and also down to things like questioning, explaining, all of the basics that happen within the lecture hall or the seminar room. Continued professional development also expands our pedagogic literacy, perhaps going on courses or reading journals, or I'd even include something like lesson study work with other colleagues as being continued professional development. Also, pedagogic literacy comes from understanding organisational cultures and understanding the politics and the power relationships, and how the kind of pedagogies that we want to develop fit within the wider frameworks and agendas that are set by the organisation. And then finally, the understanding of research. Obviously, scholarship of teaching and learning, there's a big debate about how it relates to research. Is scholarship really about reading and applying? Is it about doing research? I would argue that really to develop pedagogic literacy over a sustained period of time, there has to at least be an engagement with and an understanding of the research literature around teaching and learning, and preferably at least some engagement with actual primary research. But obviously that takes time, it takes effort, and it involves a fair amount of reading. So obviously the research angle is the most difficult one, but if we're going to be critical in our understanding and our development of pedagogy, then obviously understanding the methodologies, understanding the context and results of research is extremely important. But we would argue that taking all of these things together as a continual journey really of becoming is what really singles out lecturers or teachers in schools as becoming increasingly pedagogically literate. And therefore it's about professional dialogue, professional reporting, community activity, rather than having to jump through performative hoops to satisfy some external agency that somehow we're doing the job properly, because that's actually not what professionalism is about. These are just a couple of links to websites that we've created. The top one is more of a research website, the bottom one how to do lesson study. But we believe as a research group at the School of Education, University of Leicester, that actually lesson study has a huge potential in helping to develop collaborative approaches to deeper and broader understandings of pedagogy, and through that beginning to publish about that work, and therefore is very aligned with the whole notion of scholarship for teaching and learning.